All right, praise the Lord. We're going to make some progress tonight. We might actually cover 2 verses. All right. Does anyone need a handout? Anyone need a handout? They're on the pulpit there in the back on the podium. I'm so glad you're here tonight, man. I posted the other week that I was excited because I knew we were coming to Genesis, but the longer I'm in it, the more I see the amazement of God's Word. So tonight, Amanda, I hope to answer a lot of questions that you and I talked about. And I've had so many questions as we've been going through these series. So please stop me at any point. Last week we had a lot of good discussion. Appreciate all the feedback from everyone. And you know what? I love when people disagree with something because that's when you really are stretched. And if it's just the same thing, you're never really challenged in your thinking. So sometimes I challenge you on purpose because I want you to wrestle with it. And that's okay. That's okay to wrestle with it. So let's start. We're going to be still in verses 3 through 5, but hopefully we're going to cover all of them tonight. So if you're there in Genesis chapter 1, say word. The Word of God says, "Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day." May God bless the reading of His Word. If you haven't been here very, very much, one of the things we've been talking about is that chapter 1, the creation narrative, is intended to teach us that God creates by giving purpose and function to the material universe. So that God's creative act is not simply in fashioning matter, but in giving matter purpose. And so that's really what we're going to see tonight, that God makes stuff do something. Actually, the stuff is not the point of the story. The point of the story is what the stuff does. As we've talked about, Hebrew creation means to arrange and make useful. The opening picture in verse 2 is a picture where nothing is functioning. Let's review that for a minute in verse 2. The earth was without form, it was void, darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. So there was no form, meaning no shape. There was empty and void, meaning no content. And there was darkness, meaning no light. Nothing could grow, nothing could flourish, nothing could produce. There could be no plants, there could be no human beings because there was no darkness, there was no land actually. Everything was covered with water. And so nothing was functioning. So the opening picture is that the stuff was not doing anything. Okay? One of the most useful things that chapter 1 teaches us is that God creates with order. Meaning that God doesn't just make stuff, but He makes stuff that does something. So here's the amazing thing about Genesis chapter 1. The amazing thing about Genesis chapter 1 is not that God created light, but that God causes the light to do something. And this is what we're seeing in this chapter, that the Hebrew is not concerned with the photons because they didn't even have a clue what photons were. They were concerned with what would the light accomplish. And as He progressively works His way towards human beings on day 6, the question is going to be, what are human beings supposed to accomplish? What is their function? Because if we don't understand our function, we won't do anything. And our life will be meaningless. So, God does everything in chapter 1. We're seeing a purpose and a strategy, and nothing is by chance. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this last week or not, but Genesis is actually an argument against the pagan gods of Egypt. In the pagan gods of Egypt, if you will recall, Moses grew up under the household of the Pharaoh, and he would have been educated in Egyptian paganism and polytheism. So he would have heard about all the Egyptian gods. And in paganism, all the gods conflict with one another. So the gods are always fighting. The god of the sea is fighting with the god of the harvest. The god of the harvest is fighting with the god of the sun. The god of the sun is fighting with the god of fertility, and on and on and on. And what you're trying to do in pagan worship is you're trying to pacify these gods to make them calm down. Honestly, the pagan gods are like 2-year-old children. Okay? The pagan gods are like Mayer when he's throwing a tantrum. And honestly, I know this is not good, but I give him a piece of gum. Calms down. Okay? It's a miracle. And so, in pagan religion, they were trying to calm the gods down so that the gods would function peacefully. If you calm down the god of the storm, then your crops won't be demolished in the flood. If you calm down the god of the sea, then your fishing boat will not get destroyed. And so in pagan religion of Egypt, these gods were conflicting with one another and nothing was in order. Does that make sense? So what Genesis is showing us, as Moses is writing, he's proving to those coming out of Egypt that the one God, Yahweh, is not like the other gods. He's not chaotic. He's not fighting with any other gods. He's not in submission to any other beings. He is clearly in control and sovereign. So what we're seeing is a sovereign God who does things with precision and with strategy and with order. So the question we did not fully answer last week is, what will the light do? It won't just illuminate things, but it will accomplish something. As we mentioned, the text is not concerned with how the light is produced and where it comes from. You'll notice that the sun has not been created yet. The stars have not been created yet, but light is created. And so it's not a scientific account because it doesn't matter where the light comes from. I mean, in order for there to be light, there has to be a source, but chapter 1 is not worried about that. We're worried about what will it do? What will it accomplish? And as I said, this all makes sense because chapter 1 is concerning the functional purpose of light and not the material origins of light. Last week we talked about what it means for God to ascribe and determine what is good. As John so eloquently pointed out last week, God is the only thing that is intrinsically good because He is in Himself fully moral and fully righteous and fully holy. But material things are not intrinsically good, such as if we look at verse 2, we see the earth was already existing, but the reason it wasn't good is because it wasn't doing anything. I mean, if you just have, a rock or a piece of wood, that piece of wood is not doing anything. Matter in and of itself is not moral. But God makes it moral by telling it what to do. Once something has a purpose and a function, then it accomplishes something for God and for God's glory. So the earth was already existing in verse 2, but what God does is He comes into stuff and He begins arranging the stuff. And so we talked about what it means for God to ascribe goodness. And let's see. The matter existed, it did not do anything. So things are determined good by God when they're able to accomplish something. Okay. So, in verse 5, here's what we see. God calls the light day. And the darkness he called night. Now, the darkness existed before, right? The darkness existed before verse 5. Actually, the darkness existed in verse 2. The darkness was over the face of the deep. Everything was dark. But back in verse 2, the darkness didn't have a purpose because it was not divided from anything. You'll remember last week we say every day in creation God divides something. God separates something. When your children are arguing, the way you make them functional is you separate them. You go to your room, clean your room, do something. You divide something, you make it functional. So God divides the light from the darkness, and he calls the light day. He calls the darkness night. So the darkness already existed, but after he divided something, he gave the darkness a purpose. And furthermore, darkness is not a material thing. It's actually the absence of material things, but now the darkness has a function because it's separated from something. So God takes nothing, darkness, and calls it something. Isn't that amazing? God calls the nothing and makes it something. That's beautiful. Same thing he does with us. He takes the nothing and makes it something. So he calls the light day, meaning the light which he saw that was good is given a function and a purpose. If the light could not have served a purpose, it would not have been good. Because it's good, he gives it a purpose. And what the light will do, and this is the thesis of our discussion tonight, is the light will be used as a measurement of time. So light in and of itself, if it's flying through the Eagle Nebula, light in and of itself doesn't do anything. But when light is divided from the darkness, it does something, and that's why he calls it day. And what we're going to see is that day is a measurement of time. So in the first happening, he assigns function to time itself. Because in order for there to be a created order and system, he has to have measurements of time for everything to be measured by. Does that make sense? If there is no measurement of time, there can't be an order. For example, if you show up to work and the boss man says, we're going to build a skyscraper, and he says, we're going to work till it's done. You're going to be there for the next 73 weeks. If there's not a measurement of what you're going to do in a given day, if you don't know when you clock in and when you clock out, you're just going to say, this is impossible. I can't just accomplish everything without stopping. And so we see what happens is God sets up an order for creation to operate in. And things are going to systematically come in line and in succession. God just doesn't go, could God have done that? I'm certain he could. But why didn't he? Why didn't God create? Well, that's interesting. Pause. Sounds like maybe someone who's missing the sermon. Hey, Pastor, FaceTime me. No, get here. Some people say, why don't you do Facebook Live? I said, then everyone will stay at home. We don't do that. Okay. Where were we? God, why didn't God create everything in one day? I mean, if he were to show how powerful he was, just God said, let the universe be. There it is. But he didn't do that. He chose to reveal himself through 6 successive creations or 6 successive periods. And he did that to reflect something that will be in nature, that nature operates in an ordered system. Okay? The butterfly doesn't come before the caterpillar. You know why? Because God ordained that there be a system for the butterfly. The plant doesn't spring forth out of the apple. Wouldn't that be weird if you were eating an apple and this branch grows in your mouth? Why doesn't it do that? Because God ordained that there would be a succession to the material cosmos. And that order reflects who He is as creator. It reflects that He is a structured, systematic, logical, divine, holy being who does things with a purpose. And so that all of creation reflects His attributes. And He does that in an ordered period of time. And so in order for all that to happen, He has to create time first. And so that's what we see on day one. He institutes light as a measurement of time. Light will occur in intervals. The absence of light will be evening, and the presence of light will be day. I'll be honest with you, I have never understood why the Hebrew day starts at sunset until now. This is going to explain why the Hebrew day starts at sunset. When does the Hebrew Sabbath start, the Jewish Sabbath? Friday night. Isn't that weird? So on Friday night, you can do no work. On Friday night, you're not supposed to go to the racetrack or whatever if you're Jewish. You know, our Sabbath, Lord's Day, is Sunday morning. We wake up. Sunday evening, that's the Lord's Day. But theirs starts on Friday night. And I've always thought, why? It's because in Genesis, darkness came before light. So God actually started His work in darkness. So when God began His process, it was dark. And in that period, He brought in light, and then it was light. So the start of God's process was dark, and the second half was light. And that's why it says, the evening and the morning were the first day. So the Jewish day reflects God's created system. Now here's some good points. Let's say, I know deer season's gone now, isn't it? Is there any hunters here? They may be in the deer stand right now. I don't know. Deer season's gone, right? Okay. But let's say this Saturday, you're getting up at, you're going to get in, meet your buddy at 3 a.m. to go deer hunting. Well, what does your Friday night look like? What time are you going to bed? Early, right? You're going to bed about 8 o'clock, right? Because when Friday night comes, what are you doing? You're setting your camouflage out. You're setting your boots out. You're setting everything out to see. Your experience actually starts Friday evening. Because if you don't plan Friday evening, you're not going to make it 3 o'clock Saturday morning. Same way with God. His pattern started in the darkness and then was continued in the light. So the darkness, we don't know how long the darkness was before the light came. And actually, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is God's creation started in dark and proceeded into light. And that's why the evening and the morning were the first interval. Does that make sense? So the Jewish day still follows that pattern. That's why the Sabbath starts in the dark and proceeds to the light, because that's how God started. He starts in the dark, proceeds to the light. Yes?
You could say an interval.
Yep.
There's some, even Baptists, that believe that it wasn't a full 6-day creation.
Yep.
So when you say interval, you mean 24 hours?
Okay. Let me repeat that for the video, just in case. So the question was, a lot of people say that the creation account was 6 24-hour periods, and some say it wasn't 6 24-hour periods. Okay? So we're going to answer that. Which one was it? And that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. So let's look at this. It says that light is called day. In verse 5, God called the light day. And so, Holly, you see I have put there that is the Hebrew word yom. All right? So I want everyone to follow this process. The Hebrew word for day is yom. Everyone say yom. Yom. Right, that's what I think of. The Hebrew word for day is yom. And so what we're going to see below is other occurrences of yom. Now there's 2,000 and something occurrences of yom in the Old Testament, but we're just going to look at a few to see what this word yom means. In Genesis 4:3, it says, "In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord." So we see in Genesis 4:3, yom is translated as time. Everyone look in your Bible to Genesis 4:3. And tell me what your translation says there. So you're looking for the word, Genesis 4:3, in the course of time. Process of time, okay? When it was time. Okay? But again, that word yom is still translated as time, right? Anyone else have something different? Mine says it came about in the course of time. Anyone else have something different? Does anyone says day in Genesis 4:3? No. Because, okay. I've never actually even heard of the New English translation, but, the Net Bible. That's it. Net Bible. Okay. In the course of time, in the process of time, at the designated time. The Hebrew word there is translated time. That means when the period arrived. Not necessarily when Tuesday got here, not necessarily when Sunday got here, but in the process of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. So we see there, yom is translated as time. All right? Genesis 6:5 says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." Again, the word yom is translated there as time. Now this makes sense when God called the light yom. Because he said, light, you're going to be day, which yom is also translated time. So he's setting this pattern of measurement with regards to light. How do we measure time today? When do you know it's time to go into work? Let's say no one has a watch. Let's say you live 400 years ago. How do you know when it's time for work? When the sun comes up. Light becomes your time. How do you know when it's time to go to bed? Nope. It's when Mayor stops crying. Okay? I will kid you not. We'll lay him down. He climbs out of his crib 11 times a night. I said, "Son, what are you doing?" "My belly hurts." "Go to bed." He gets out again. "Son, what are you doing?" "I got to brush my teeth." You already brushed your teeth. Anyway, I'm a little bitter. Yeah. So light, and the period of light, becomes the measurement of time. Okay? So God called the light yom. Day. Interval. Time. Okay? How about Genesis 18:11? "Now Sarah and Abraham were old and advanced in age." That's the word yom. Meaning, they had many, many yom. I'm going to start going up to people. How many yom are you? Right? "Oh, you look very little yom." Right? So, what does it mean that their age was advanced? They had much yom. And so the translators take yom and translate that to age. They had many, many yom. What about Genesis 26:8? "When Isaac had been there a long time." Again, the word yom. Now, you will find in the Old Testament The majority of the time, yom is translated day, because normally it does mean day. But it doesn't only mean day. It has many, many other uses which refer to a measurement of time or a appropriate or certain period of time. Okay? Any questions so far on yom? Yeah. Correct. It could have been. Now, I'm not saying that it is. Okay? Correct. Yes. Till day 4. So that's the conversation I was having with some of the young folks who were over in the youth house. They wanted a preview of tonight, and they were saying, well, what about 24 hours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, how do we know what 24 hours is? It's when the sun comes up and when it comes back up the next time. Well, the sun doesn't even exist till day 4. Well, by the time Moses wrote it, correct. But in the creation narrative, yeah. They already know it's an interval. Yeah. Yeah. They know what the interval is, but they also know what the Hebrew word yom is. And what happens is we limit the Hebrew word yom to just 24-hour period. Yom Kippur means Day of Atonement. See, that's the same day. No, well, actually, it's Yom Kippurim, which means the Day of Atonement. But again, understand Yom means period. Don't assign it. What happens is we assign it a meaning which is based on our language, not based on their language. So again, I'm not saying that Yom doesn't mean day. But I'm also not saying that Yom doesn't ever mean period. And that's why I've included these other references here where Yom is translated as time and age, to show that the Hebrew mind would not have simply limited Yom to 24 hours. Okay. Yeah? Continually. So in verse 6:5, evil continually, that word is yom, right? It's not just means, exactly. Yom means over and over and over and over. Okay? Someone else had a question back here. John. So the light he called day, and the darkness he'd called night. I don't know it off the top of my head. Yeah. But again, what is God doing on day 1? The night already existed. The darkness was already there. But when he called it night in reference to it being divided from the light. Okay? So whatever period the night was divided from dark to day, because of that division, because of that measurement, now darkness had a function. And now that function was going to be night. And so the question is, why do we concern ourselves with believing that God had to perform this function in 24 hours? I always ask the question, see, people say, is it 24 hours? I say, why is that important? And because we do, but again, why is it important for God to operate in 24 hours? Exactly. So you're actually trying to say that God doesn't need to operate according to human basis. Very, very good. Yes. For God, And that's why someone Google where it says, a day is like 1,000 years. And in that verse, will someone do that? Millennial? Please, Stephanie. Some young millennial, please. A day for the Lord is like 1,000 years. And in Hebrew, what's it? Ooh, that's in New Testament. So let's go there for a minute. Second Peter 3:8, and I didn't even put it on the notes because honestly, I didn't think about it in preparation today. 2 Peter 3:8. Go ahead, Adrian.
But do not forget this one thing, dear friends, that the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance.
Here's the other thing that we have to think also. God exists outside of space and time. From God's perspective, everything that has ever happened in history, he sees all at once. So, for us to say that God operated in 24 hours is for us to say that God somehow subjected himself to the material universe, which I know is a philosophical argument that is not important right now, but I think what we know is that God still existed outside of space and time in this process as everything was happening. So, what now? Again, God could have created everything in 24-hour periods. That's fine. And for someone who says that, all I don't want someone to say is if you don't believe in 24-hour periods, you don't believe the Bible. And the reason I don't want to support someone who says that is because that's not what a Hebrew is looking for. And that's not what a Jewish audience is concerned with in it. That question is a scientific Westerner who's trying to look at everything through the lens of scientism. For a Jew, they're looking through the lens of theology. What is God doing in creation? He's assigning function. He's making everything work. And on day one, he's making the light a measurement of order. And that pattern, which God... So let's say this. God sets the pattern, but does not have to subject himself to the pattern. God determines nature, but God does not work within the confines of nature because miracles happen because God does things that naturally won't happen. So God never limits himself to simply what nature can do. And in fact, in the Old Testament, there was a period of time where God made the sun stand still for 3 hours. So God does whatever he wants, even making the natural order stop. So if you want to affirm 24-hour periods, that's fine. If you don't, I think it's fine. What I want you to take away from it is that he is a God of order and a God that institutes what things do, who does not subject himself to those things. He is always above and sovereign over those things. Okay, so in conclusion, throughout the rest of Scripture, light is referred to light and not day. So in Genesis 1, he calls the light day. But for the rest of Genesis, he calls light light. Why doesn't he call light day for the rest of the Bible? Because it's not the light itself which is a day, but the measurement of life as it's divided from the darkness. Does that make sense? What happened on day one is that once light came on the scene, it divided light and darkness. And so after that division, look at this, once it divides light from darkness, then it's called day. So it's only called day with reference to its function. Does that make sense? The only reason it's called day is because it divides darkness. For the rest of the Old Testament, it's not called day. But here, chapter 1 is trying to tell us what it does, and so here it's telling us that light is day. In Hebrew thought, a day begins in the darkness and ends during the light. And the Hebrew day is a reflection of God's work beginning in the dark. God comes into the darkness and brings light into the dark. That's not just a picture of creation, that's a picture of salvation and His whole redemption history, that God comes into the darkness and He is the one who brings in light. John Walton says at the bottom, on day one, God creates time. This is the first of the functions God will use to bring order to the chaos, the orderly and regular sequence of time. So, what we see, day one, God created the measurement of order, which will be time. And for the rest of the days, that first system is used to determine what happens each of the rest of those periods of time. Okay? Any closing observations there? Yes, sir.
I think you hit it right. We see this beginning of Revelation of God, but we also, like you said, it's the sovereignty of God.
Yes.
You made it in a day, but you can snap fingers and do it.
Right.
It's more on the theology part, like you said, people. It's just what they're concerned with.
Yeah.
It's just to show that our one God is sovereign over all these other gods that you say control this. He can
Yeah.
do everything.
Amen.
I think that's good synopsis. I never thought about that until going through it.
Mm.
Think more scientifically, because everybody here, even though they think they don't like science, you think scientifically. You have
Yep.
to have a reason for it.
Yep.
It can't be because God is sovereign.
Mm.
That doesn't make sense to us as a Western mind.
Yeah. That's good. Any other observations? Okay. Well, our time has ended because we are orderly and systematic like God. We must close. So let's close with prayer. Father, thank you for our ability to wrestle with your word, and we know that you have given us the most glorious and beautiful text that's ever